Good evening and welcome to this week's 2020 Vision, a light-hearted look at the news around East London with myself, Jenny Fisher from East London News, and our guest tonight is Julian Sharpe, who's a local activist. We've had you on before, Julian, so welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me. As
Yeah, you're
always, it's
welcome.
always a pleasure to come on here. How are you, Jenny?
Oh, don't ask, don't ask. Grumpy as ever. But let's
I'm glad to hear it.
between us. Yeah, no change. Let's what we're going to try to do tonight is to look at how coronavirus is actually changing the way we live. In the past few months, we've been saying, oh, well, after lockdown ceases and we're back to normal, and is it going to be a new normal or was it an old normal or whatever? And now it looks like it's going to be a much longer, prolonged crisis than ever, perhaps with some prolonged consequences. So the first thing I want to ask you, Julian, though, is not directly on COVID. I want to give you a test, which I haven't warned you about at all, and ask you who Nick Thomas Simmons is.
Oh, I used to know this, but now I've forgotten, I'm afraid, to quote somebody.
Can you go? Can you go somewhere near? I mean, I can see your next door neighbour. No.
I don't think it's the next. It was he a shadow minister?
Well done, well done. Only you've clearly got your finger on the pulse here because I didn't have a clue who this man was, but he is indeed. He's the current Shadow Home Secretary. And
Wow,
why
okay.
I mention him is because, of course, we've had to really, we've got to. COVID's obviously not just happening in the UK, and other life goes on. And we've seen the dreadful news today about 4 deaths, including 2 children, in a boat of migrants coming to the UK again. And the Home Secretary herself has said she's truly sad, which I don't think is quite enough, really. But I was very disappointed about. I thought, let's look up Labour's response. Let's see what that is. And Nick Thomas Simmons has given Labour's response, which I think is a bit of a shame. Keir Starmer, I think, should really have stepped in to do it, except of course he was been involved in a minor road accident today. And Nick Thomas Simmons MP, Shadow Home Secretary, says this incident is an absolute tragedy. Our thoughts are with those who have lost loved ones and people who have been injured. It is a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of this crisis. And I must say I was distinctly underwhelmed by that. Do you think he could have gone a bit further?
Well, I suppose the short answer is yes. I mean, obviously, in a tragedy like this, the first thing I think you have to say is that, the thoughts are with the family and friends of the people who've died, and to have children die in such circumstances, obviously, is absolutely appalling. But I think you do have to look as well at the causes of this crisis. I mean, yesterday the current Home Secretary, so was Tory Home Secretary, was praising the military for doing this, taking capture of a tanker, Isle of Wight. But of course, today compare that with the the refugees, the migrants who have died, and children who've died. It's absolutely appalling. So you have to look at causes and the reasons behind this, and and a lot of that is to do with the crises that are elsewhere in the world, that's in the Middle East, in Africa, and Asia. That people don't have proper jobs there. They don't have proper livelihood. They can't live decent lives there. And it's not surprising, they want to try and, do better for themselves and move countries and, come to this country.
Well, it's mixed, isn't it? I mean, there are some parts of Africa where the economy is actually doing very well. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Particularly where I think there's been Chinese investment in infrastructure such as internet infrastructure. But I don't know. I don't know. I just don't have patience with this sort of approach any longer. I know you're a very patient person, and I'm not a patient person, but I really don't see why the opposition party isn't coming out and saying we've really got to stop ripping off other countries so that people are kept in poverty over there. and feel that they might have a better deal coming over here. I don't know. Let's
Well,
crush the causes.
well. Of course, this all goes back to Sir Keir Starmer's strategy as Labour Party leader of, in a sense, not being out patriated by the Tories, so to speak. He's determined to put forward a patriotic attitude. He's determined not to be attacked in any way whatsoever on those issues, which well, to me, is not a strategy for winning the next election. But also, as well, because of that, then you end up in some grotesque positions being taken, in my view. And you rightly pointed out this is one of them. I mean, yes, obviously, the first thing you do is express sympathy for these losses and these tragic deaths. But then you do have to, move on and talk about the causes of the migrant
Yeah,
crisis and
exactly.
come up with some solutions. It's no good just effectively, following in the wake of the current Home Secretary and,
No.
clearly not advocating some sort of alternative to the well, frankly, racist policies, that's been
It is,
pursued.
that's the trouble. I mean, when Labour lost so many seats in the sort of pro-Brexit areas, parts of the country, the North and the Midlands, I just thought, well, you're not watching the Isle of Dogs in 1993. Yeah, we've done it before. We know what it's like. If you're soft on racism, then you drive people into that, and particularly voters, into the hands of right extremism. And I think it's about time we stopped doing it. So there we are. That's my verdict.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you have to be
Good.
very hard, I think. I mean, if there's one lesson I've learned, I mean, obviously, from my accent, I'm not originally from around here. But I moved to Harmless a very long time ago now. You can see I picked up the accent. But one thing I have learned from my time in Harmless is the need to be very hard on any type of racism. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But of course, the economic despair isn't only isn't only in the poorer countries. Somebody, I was in a totally different Zoom meeting a few days ago, and somebody was saying, "Oh, we could have a world recession," and it started me thinking. And I thought, well, actually, all the rich countries are borrowing so much money, but they're also sort of losing their industry, their capacity to manufacture, because the poorer countries can't buy the manufactured goods or services anyway. So how are they going to pay back these enormous debts, which essentially are gambling on the future value of their economies, which may not happen? And so I spoke up in the Zoom discussion, whatever it was, and said, well, maybe we're going to see a complete change in the world order. And maybe these powerful countries whose political power comes from their economic power are going to find themselves tipped over as they struggle to maintain any kind of economy for their people. And everybody rounded on me and said, "Oh, rubbish, we all got out of the recession in the 1930s, and that was a terrible one, and it came just a decade after a pandemic. So they managed to get out of it before, they'll do it again." I'm not so sure. What do you think about that? Do you think we're in for a completely new world order?
Wow, big questions. Well, I mean, we got out of the recession in the 1930s, so having a world war.
Exactly. That was my point.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Well
it's
done,
a good
Julian.
point.
Yes.
I agree with you. And obviously, a world war now would mean, nuclear annihilation. That's just not on the cards. It's just ridiculous. So, I mean, we are facing a big economic downturn, almost a depression. I think everybody's saying that. Yes, I think, I think it started before COVID. I think it started before the epidemic. There was a fall in production, GDP, whatever you want to call it. It was clearly happening. I think it happened in China or so, actually, before the epidemic struck. But in any case, it happened before. Obviously, the epidemic has made things an awful lot worse. I think that goes without saying. They're talking in some sectors about even if there was, a vaccine tomorrow and everybody's vaccinated, it would take perhaps 3 or 4 years to get back to the levels we were in 2019, just last year. So we are facing a big economic downturn and depression, effectively.
Do we want to get back to where we were in 2019, or do we want to get somewhere different?
It's a short thing. I mean, short answer. What I mean is in a sense, the level of demand. Particularly for travel. International travel. Even if things are put right as far as the epidemic is concerned, it's going to take years to even to reach back to that. But as you rightly say, we're never going to go back to those days. Everything has changed.
But how far? And actually, with it, I mean, this is the travel thing. I think is such a good example where a lot of travel companies are in private hands. So there's been, for 6 months or so, the government has propped up jobs which were there to do a service that there wasn't actually a market or a demand for in many cases. And now private companies are sacking workers wholesale. I think one or two minor airlines actually gone bust.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is just out. So why is the government carrying on with the furloughing, with the job support scheme? Why doesn't it say, look, we're going to have to get people out of working for airlines. We're going to have to. We've been looking at a way of reducing our air travel anyway. This happens to have come along, and instead of trying to encourage people to go back on holiday and then find that was a bad idea because it just spreads the virus again, why don't we just say we need to take capacity out of the airline industry and retrain people and find different jobs for people to do? I mean, if there must be a brain clever enough in Westminster to work this out. I mean, maybe it's yours. If people who drive forklifts around airports and who baggage handlers who drive baggage to and forth there's going to be too many of them. So why can't we retrain some of them and put them into supermarket delivery where there's a demand for more people? You still can't. It's still very difficult to get a supermarket delivery slot, while at the same time we're paying airline workers to sit at home. I don't understand it, Julian. Do you understand it at all? Do you understand what the government's economic strategy is?
Well, I think the real thing that's going on is obviously there's a big division in the government about economic strategy. I think you have those like the current chancellor who want essentially to end support for people hit by the epidemic, for people whose jobs and companies and so on are hit by the epidemic. You can clearly see that he wants to rein in spending. The support being given to people and companies affected by the epidemic is a lot less now than it was at the start of the epidemic, and that's going to further reduce. And there are people facing real poverty because of this epidemic, and you can see the government reducing support for them and just telling people, "Oh, well, just claim universal credit," as if that's enough for a family to live on. And you can see it's not, and you can see it's a huge increase in the use of food banks. So. So as I say, there are people like the current chancellor who believe in cutting back in this expenditure. But on the other hand, there are other people in the government who clearly think that something has got to be done, because unless something is done, unless some form of support is given to people, then people are not going to put up with it. And I wouldn't blame people.
So basically,
I think there's a big division about these sorts of issues, and I think in some respects, I think the Chancellor will probably back up what you're saying. Actually, Jenny, it's probably say, well, these companies are, these jobs don't fit the new normal. We should just let them go. Very sort of Thatcherite.
I didn't say let them go.
I know.
I said pick them up and consciously retrain them rather than pretending.
Well,
that
absolutely,
they can carry on.
yeah. But you can see, some people clearly want a sort of a hard-nosed Thatcherite market-based solution where, the market decides what's a viable job and what isn't a viable job, and if you're not in a viable job, hard luck. You have to, go on your bike or retrain or whatever, and that's it. There's people in the government who disagree with that. Now, personally, I think even the people who disagree with the sort of hard-nosed approach have got it wrong, because they're not given enough support. And if anything, I think the government should step in and nationalise some of these sectors of the economy, or perhaps a lot of the sectors of the economy, and the companies involved, and rationally plan the economy so that it can provide jobs for them at a decent wage.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about the government having a row with itself. I suppose that does sound incredibly plausible. But are there really any hard-nosed Thatcherites still out there? Surely that's incredible. That must be discredited by now. The answer, I mean, at the moment, that you just sort of... I always thought the Thatcherite approach was really the stick rather than the carrot. It's up to you to find a job. Go and look for one, and we'll keep benefits as low as possible to really encourage you, make you totally desperate. There's no...
well, I mean, I think a lot of people in Manchester and Yorkshire at the moment feel they're going through exactly that. Jobs are going because, the COVID restrictions. The COVID restrictions are entirely rational. You have to find some way to, deal with this epidemic. But clearly they're not given the support they should be given. And if, the people up north feel it's a repeat of the 1980s. They're being experimented upon. They're, getting the worst end of the stick. They're not getting the support, they're getting. And clearly, but you just wait. They'll come here. They'll come to Tarhamless. They'll come to the East End of London. They'll come to Newham, and it'll be the poor and deprived areas of the country that will be hit the most. You can see it. In a sense, what's happening in Manchester now will be the East End of London in a month or so's time. So these are desperate issues.
So your scenario is you've got your Chancellor, Rishi, whatever his name is, sat there saying, "Blimey, I've got a lot." I mean, Julian, it actually sounds more like a soap opera than the government of the nation. So he sat there saying, "Oh, I've got to pay it all back. I'm a bit worried. Let's try and cut it down." Apparently, there's some hard-nosed Thatcherites wandering around saying, "Oh, tell them all to get on their bikes." And then there's Boris, who seems to be, I don't know, I think people are sort of saying, "Oh, Boris is strangely indecisive," but I can't see any difference between Boris as Prime Minister and Boris as Mayor of London.
Yeah.
I think he's exactly the same.
Well, I mean, it's the usual thing. When he was Mayor of London, often you can hold him and disappear for long periods of time. If there was bad news to be announced, he'd send one of his lackeys out to announce the bad news. If there's good news, he insists on doing it himself. And, the same pattern when he was Mayor of London as when he was Prime Minister. But I think, I think the Prime Minister likes to be loved. So, he doesn't want to, cut the support for people because clearly, it's going to make people angry. And as I said, a lot of people are facing very real hardships, very real hardships.
Yes, I mean, I think his party got a lot of support because people thought he was, an odd bloke, but a reasonably nice one. So, well-meaning. And they're now discovering the truth. And I think he probably feels quite uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, and the sort of fake Churchillian rhetoric as well. I mean, but of course, as we all know, I mean, I don't want to go into personalities too much, but there's obviously it's questionable whether Boris Johnson is a nice bloke, for example. But yeah, but I think the indecisiveness of the government over, for example, the COVID restrictions, over how they place areas into different tiers, how they take areas out of different tiers. I mean, what's the exit strategy? Nobody knows. Nobody has a clue what's going on. But that kind of reflects, I think, this argument that's going on within the government about how best, not just to tackle the economic consequences of the epidemic, but the epidemic itself.
Yeah. That's it.
So
I
we
mean,
can see that very clearly, I think.
And that seems again to be a problem going wider than the UK. I mean, tonight's news is that the death rate is rising quite sharply across the whole of Europe.
Yeah.
Again, having sent students out in September, the government's now claiming it's got some sort of quick test that will enable those who are negative to go home for Christmas. And then what? There's nothing to go back in January? We don't know. There's just no planning from the government, which is a poor deficit in the government,
But again,
I think.
though, I mean, look at what the students have got to go through, and throughout this epidemic. I mean, obviously, as we know, it affects being, being men and women, are hardest hit from this. It affects, being men and women worse than it affects white men and women. A lot of that is a question of poverty and deprivation. I think there's something out today in the news about that. So yeah, absolutely. But of course, if anybody's affected more than anybody, I think it's young people. They're the ones, for example, at university, and I'm, very fortunate to go to university. But I mean, they're not having proper classes. They're confined to their homes a lot of the time. They can't really socialize. And then they get blamed for the media for spreading COVID. I mean, the whole thing is just grotesque. It's awful.
Yes, I was talking to one Tower Hamlets young person who has travelled quite some distance to go to university, and he says, well, he's just sat there in his room getting all his lectures online, and really might as well be at home. So it does seem to be.
And then to say then, oh well, we've come up with this was agrees to get people home for Christmas. When you get home at Christmas, if you do, but when you do, there can only be 6 of you or however many it's going to be. I mean, the whole thing is just nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. I think everybody knows it's nonsense. I think that's why there's a kind of undercurrent of, I don't know, how to express it.
There's a sort of grumblingness, isn't there, going on about, oh no, not again, not another one, not more of this. It doesn't make sense. Where's the good news? Where's the turn up for?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the government doesn't appear to have a strategy for any of this. It doesn't have a strategy, certainly, for the economic consequences of the epidemic. So as you say, you just left, wondering, well, is this it? I mean, this is as good as it gets. It's obviously going to get worse in the next few months. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, what I haven't worked out yet. I mean, there's been some interesting stuff on the radio from interviewing people from Liverpool and Manchester. Not so much the Midlands, not so much Yorkshire, but Liverpool and Manchester seem to be what the national media is concentrating on, and people who remember the 80s and what the unemployment was like then, particularly the youth unemployment, and talking about how they just feel that there's a return to the 80s and what we all went through there. But I'm wondering a bit more. So if we look at what happens is happening in Tower Hamlets, there's a sort of strange mismatch, a call for extra money, and yet it's not enough. Yet we're not quite sure what it's getting spent on. It all seems a bit odd. Now, two things have sort of come to light in one sense, which could almost be seen as positive, I suppose, but then there's a lot of negatives. So in Tower Hamlets, we know there was a £35 million shortfall in the budget this year because of extra expenditure, although we don't know what that extra expenditure was. And we also know a couple of things. The last cabinet decided to give another year's funding to the COVID-19 volunteer hub. There's a volunteer hub, apparently, where over 2,000 volunteers are being trained to help in the community. I don't know what they're doing in the community. I don't know what your inbox is like, but mine is full of individuals who say they are organising food for children over half term to sort of meet the holiday hunger. So I don't know what the volunteers are doing. One or two of them actually I have spoken to and have been very helpful, but generally speaking, I don't know why. Who these 2,300 people are? They're volunteers, so the money can't be going on them, but they're there. And then I'm just going to put this up to the camera. I got this jolly document through the door a couple of days ago, and it's a letter from the mayor. And I thought, oh, lovely, a letter from the mayor on thick paper, glossy printing. And then I realised it wasn't actually a 4-page letter from the mayor; it was a 2-page letter from the mayor, which is repeated in more than one language. So it's a multilingual letter from, and it basically tells us what the restrictions are in London, the high alert area. I don't know, it's not really set out in a cut it and pin it to your fridge and keep it sort of a way, but I suppose that's quite helpful, having the restrictions all set out. It tells you to download the app, and there's a message from the mayor, which sounds, again, somehow when I read the messages from the mayor, I just find myself thinking of the Queen's Christmas message. So it tells us to stay up to date. So that's an expenditure, but lots of public services, as we know, are being cut.
Yeah.
So is that happening across London? Is this the way it's going to be? Are we going to see local authorities turn from local deliverers of service into just conveyors of information and organisers of volunteers, in which case the job losses are going to be so massive, it's going to make things worse, not better, surely. So that was my...
Yeah, I mean,
interesting thing.
Well, I mean, personally, I think it's a good thing if messages are going out about coronavirus from the council. I think that's a good thing, and more information, the better. I think. I mean, one of the things I think they've said about the restrictions is that if people aren't aware of what they should be doing and what they're not doing, so it's good if that information is getting out there. It's good if it's in more than one language. Was obviously not everybody will read English, so I think that's a good thing. But I mean, on the wider picture, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, councils, yes, here in East London, across London, in the whole of the country, are facing a huge crisis. I think we're facing a huge funding crisis in any case, because councils get most of the money from the government, and the government haven't been giving them enough money. So again, I think it's good if the council are asking the government for more money, and there should be a proper campaign, like there was in Popular in the 1920s. That's a proper campaign to try and get more money from the government. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a big crisis there because of the epidemic. Councils, I think, have lost even more money, particularly revenues. And I think they're facing awful problems. So you're seeing, like you're seeing in Tower Hamlets, you're seeing cuts after cut after cut. And this is a terrible thing because of the nature of council services. I suppose these cuts are affecting in the sense the poorest in society, the people least able to cope themselves, people who depend on the council services. You're seeing cuts to special educational needs teaching. You saw the Meals on Wheels service being done away with, I think it was last year. There's rumours, I'm not sure how true they are, perhaps you know better than I do, Jenny, I'm sure. But there's rumours that half the libraries are going to be closed. The Idea stores in Tower Hamlets. And this isn't just Tower Hamlets, of course. I'm sure it applies to other councils in London. There's very real issues and problems here. And there needs to be a serious campaign against these cuts and for spending. And not just say a petition circulated half-heartedly amongst right-thinking people, so to speak. I think you have to involve the communities in these areas.
Well, I don't know. The communities seem to be very much on the back foot, I suppose, partly because they are actually struggling with coronavirus and trying to live through the pandemic and all the financial worry. I think financial worry is always very debilitating, and that's got to be part of it. Yes, I mean, on the, I haven't got it all here, but I have been sent, you mentioned the ideas stores. As well as the ideas stores, of course, there's also a couple of local libraries. And I think there's some worry about those libraries. I think they must be closed at the moment. But somebody sent me an extract from the Cabinet Papers, and on Cubitt Town Library, which of course is a building very dear to both of us, the Cabinet Paper said we propose not to reopen this site in the short term, and then to have a consultation about whether to close it permanently from the end of March 2021. Footfall at Cubitt Town Library is significantly lower than any of our other sites, as is the usage of public PCs. That must be computers. The idea store at Canary Wharf is not popular with all local residents, but it's close by, and in the long term, we hope to replace they've got all these initials here, the idea stores at Canary Wharf with the new and more centrally located idea store as part of the planned Cross Harbour development. And then we will look to use the building to benefit the community and generate income to offset our costs. So it sounds like a library which is currently free to use, except you can't because it's shut, is going to be a community centre which the public are going to have to pay for. And I can understand, I mean, that we can't offer community venues for free across the board, but people are being charged silly money as if we're all in work. And well, I've said it before, in terms of tenants' halls, the halls on many estates which are run by tenants and residents associations are often hired out for children's birthdays or baptisms or parts of Muslim wedding services, and they can be the only way a child can get a birthday party and make that memory of having had a birthday party, precisely because people can't afford the commercial rates. So goodness knows what rates the libraries are going to be let out at, and to whom they're going to be let out. So I think you're right. That it's not just a rumour. It's in the Cabinet Papers that there's going to be a consultation on not opening Cubitt Town Library again, and there's something they are going to open Bethnal Green Library, but only for 15 hours a week. Whilst numbers are still relatively low at Bethnal Green, it's a much loved presence in the community, and it's very, very valued. Well, Cubitt Town's a much loved presence in the community as well. So I don't know what's going wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, many moons ago, I was a local authority councillor in Tower Hamlets, and one of the things we fought against and managed to win actually was the same proposal to close Cubitt Town Library. So the idea is resurrected. I mean, in times of crisis like this, I think the officers like to blow the dust off proposals they put forward years ago that failed and don't represent the best interest of the community, which is why they failed, and resurrect them and say, well, because it's a crisis, we now have to do this. And I think it's nonsense, basically. Closing on Cubitt Town Library. I think it's nonsense restricting the hours at Bethnal Green Library, actually. I used to use it. I used to live near there. And again, that's a great library. It's a great building. But it's as you say, it's there for the community.
Well, it's such a contrast. If you go back to the 1980s, what we had was not only Cubitt Town Library, which has a small room sort of on the side of it, which has been used by various Bangladeshi organisations since Bangladeshi people arrived on the Isle of Dogs in '86. That's not a joke. That is virtually what happened. And we also had Jack Dash House, which had an art centre, an art gallery in it, didn't it, with public exhibitions. Yep. It had a local authority day nursery in it, and it had meeting rooms, and it had various functions of the council. So it was a real hub for the community. Gone. That resource is just gone. We had two community centres on the Samuda side, on the eastern side of Manchester Road, gone under one housing group, and we had one community centre on the west side of Manchester Road, which fortunately is still there and actually still delivering a service. So community really has given up a lot in terms of who's paying for the crisis. And if we're heading for the economic disaster you think we might be, which I agree we might well be, then it's those sorts of public sector community support, that infrastructure, which was there throughout most of the 80s, not least because the Tories put it in after the riots, and it's gone. It's just not there anymore. So I think it's going to be much even harder than the 80s.
I agree. I think we're facing a massive crisis in the whole system. I think, as we've talked about, the local council is facing this crisis. And, is trying to, the only thing it's kind of basically allowed to do in the government is just to cut services, which I'm not sure is what we elect Labour councils and councillors and Labour mayors to do. But they can't see any other way out. I think there's only one way out, and that's changing the whole system, which is what you have to do. And you have to campaign and fight and, be an advocate for that.
And in Tower Hamlets, at least, it seems that it's the most vulnerable in society who are getting hammered the hardest. We're still buying all our new plant pots for not livable streets, the other one, what was it called, neighbourhood somethings, I think, and doing that sort of thing. But as an example, just such a clear example that Tower Hamlets used to have a complete jewel in the crown system of support teachers, not many of them, half a dozen for the visually impaired children, and half a dozen for children who are partially hearing. And those teachers were able to go around into schools to support children in school, in public schools, and they've been cut, or the proposal is to cut their numbers by about half. And so children will not get that support in mainstream schools, so they'll go out of borough and cost the borough more money to go out of borough places that quite possibly may not be in the public sector even. So it's forcing us to make these terrible false economies. And I thought it was interesting that the mayor did make clear that it wasn't actually a positive decision on the part of the mayor or the cabinet or the councillors to cut those staff. It was that those staff were funded out of the money given to Tower Hamlets to run its schools, which is then passed to the head teachers forum to agree a budget, how to actually spend that money. And it was they who cut or who didn't give back a chunk of money to the borough to continue running those central services, but said they preferred to keep the money in schools and do what they could there, which again is, I think, a terribly false economy. But if that is the case, then why didn't somebody have the sense to come in and say, right, okay, if the schools want to buy this service, let's keep the teachers centrally, and the schools can buy it back, instead of the borough having to pay to send children out of borough to other places. Let's keep the service, and the schools can pay for it individually if they no longer pay for it collectively. So, and I don't know what arguing was done with the head teachers forum to say, well, if you don't pay for it centrally, then some of you are going to be clobbered paying for it individually. I don't know why that wasn't, if that was done, I don't know. But it seems a strange buck passing.
Yeah, I think it's purely financial, to be honest with you. I think they wanted a certain number for the cuts that year, and that's what they decided to do. It's just, cut the money, cut the service, save the money. And of course, as you rightly say, it's, for those teachers, teaching, children with special educational needs, there's those children who suffered because of the cut. And that's the problem with these cuts. I think, you have to take a stand sooner or later and oppose them.
Good. Okay. Well, I think that almost wraps up. That I think was actually a coherent conversation, although not a cheerful one. So I think that's we can almost move to wrapping up at that point. I think things are going to. Okay, so I think we've agreed that things are going to get a great deal worse. What we haven't covered, I suppose, is the answer, but I think that's probably because neither of us knows, do we? I mean, it's easy enough to say we have to join up and fight, but you can't really do that on Zoom. I'm not quite sure how to put pressure on people these days, or quite what to ask for.
Well, I mean, you just look at the example of Black Lives Matter, for example. I mean, you can have demonstrations, you can exert pressure. In these kind of online socially distanced days, it can be done, and I think it's a magnificent example. Black Lives Matters demonstrations. I think they were brilliant. Clearly, it's had an effect. There's still a lot to be done. Obviously, it's not it's not an answer to all the problems and issues that we have today. It's a start, but it's only a start. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But that's a magnificent example to follow. But so I think we can mobilise. But but at the end of the day, what we need is a government that represents us, represents ordinary working class people. That's what we need. We need socialism, in other words.
Yes, it just was so the wrong time to lose Jeremy Corbyn, wasn't it? Which I suppose is who could have galvanised us around this sort of thing. I mean, I see there's a petition demanding that all students are refunded their tuition fees until universities can return to normal, which has become a trending hashtag.
Play fair to it. I mean,
yes, for speaking some good sense, and inspiring a lot of people, sort of the Millennium's Bob Geldof or something, I guess.
Oh no, he's a lot better than that. I mean, play fair to Max Rashford. I mean, it's a brilliant
School
campaign.
Meals.
Support him all the way. You're going to do something. But children are going hungry. Because of what's happening and because of this government. And Marcus Rashford kind of, stop that happening and doing something about it. And back him all the way and more power to his elbow.
Yes, totally. I mean, children starving in the UK, children starving in Africa. I don't think it's that easy to make a comparison between them. But there's one niggle I have is when I hear he's inspired not only a lot of sort of grassroots ordinary people, but when I hear people on high salaries say, "Oh, Marcus Rashford, he's just so wonderful, so inspirational. Let me donate something from my trolley," that kind of thing. And you just think, where were you? Where were you this time last year when there was holiday hunger? I mean, the borough, not just our borough, but boroughs in London, I think it was the GLA led on it, were running holiday hunger schemes last year. And where was the outrage then? And so, yes, all power to Marcus Rashford's elbow. But sometimes I feel the people who are new converts must have been walking around with their eyes closed. And I think that's not great.
No, but I mean, if they've, not exactly done a scene conversion, but I mean, if they have changed their minds, they have changed their views, then I think that's a good thing, actually. But as you say, hopefully, after A, there's, B, C, and D, and E, and hopefully they'll take that journey and continue down the alphabet. That's what they need to do.
Yes. So our conclusion, dear listener, is just keep fighting and keep raising all the issues and keep putting demands on your councillors. Keep pointing out to your councillors the consequences of what they are doing. I suppose at least we've now had confirmation, really, that why the council was so desperate to push new contracts on its staff, which the major part of which now seems to have been to decrease redundancy payments. And indeed, the redundancies, the cheaper redundancies are now starting just at a time when staff who may be made redundant are going to find it harder, not easier, to find jobs. So that, but still, the council is still in talks with the union, so hopefully they will find some form of agreement on that.
And to be fair to the local, Tower Hamlets Unison branch, they always said that was the game plan all along, to reduce the cost of redundancies, so the council could make more redundancies cheaper. And I think they've been proved absolutely right about that. Which I think, proves a lie that the council leadership were putting out and saying, well, these contracts are neutral, or if anything, benefit staff. I think that's just nonsense.
Indeed. I mean, that really is a difference to plumb, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the councils have in East London have said good things, positive things about how they don't want to see any holiday hunger. But it's not really hitting the headlines, and we may need to campaign now for a Christmas holiday hunger scheme, a really comprehensive one, I think. I mean, Tower Hamlets has nothing on its website. They concentrate on the volunteer hub getting more funding. Redbridge, I think, has got to go and put another 50p in the meter because they've only got very old news up, but they did have a public meeting earlier this evening, a Zoom public meeting on how to keep safe. Newham has been very positive. They are on their website. They really feature how they, as a local authority, give free school meals to everyone, all primary school pupils. Indeed, Tower Hamlets does the same, although I think they're not certain if they can carry on doing that. And they have a group called the Newham Food Alliance, which they're using to try to push out more food to prevent holiday hunger. Hackney, I think, is possibly the best because they're actually handing out vouchers to children who qualify for free school meals. This is the demand that put on the government refused to do, so Hackney are just stepping in with that kind of spirit of the 1980s again. Whereas Barking and Dagenham are fining businesses who don't follow track and trace rules. So there we are.
Okay. But Jenny, as you say, you rightly point out, and it's a good point, under these, socially distanced times, I mean, it does make it harder to campaign and organise. I don't think anybody's, denying that. So it would make sense if instead of all these councils or groups within these local authority per areas, if they all came together, because they're all facing the same issues. So rather than, be very local, almost parochial in your kind of attitude, then why not all come together and put a united position, a united front against the government? I mean, that would make sense, and you're stronger together. As I think it's the slogan of the Welsh football team.
Is it?
But it's true.
Yes. Good. Okay. Well, that's. I found that a very interesting discussion, and hopefully the viewers did too. We actually managed to have that discussion without touching on the US elections at all. So we're just crossing our fingers still on that.
Well, thank goodness. But as you say, hopefully in a week's time.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Anyway, we haven't mentioned the US elections. Yeah.
Can I recommend to you and the listeners and watchers, Keith Olbermann's podcasts or video casts on YouTube. I think they're really good.
Who is he?
Keith Olbermann.
And who is he?
Well, he is a sportscaster, but he also has quite strong views on American politics. Let's put it that way. He's worth listening to and watching.
Okay, send me the link. And
I will. And
we'll put it up in the comment section
to your listeners as well. But just Google Keith Olbermann YouTube, and I'm sure you'll find it.
Good. Okay. Right. So that's fine. In the meantime, in terms of what the population's doing, I noticed that on the petitions page on Tower Hamlets Council, public petitions, which you can't find if you use the search facility, doesn't tell you where petitions are. You can't find if you use the alphabetical grouping at the bottom. But if you go to the Council and Democracy page, where most things are, you can see the petitions. There's one petition which is closed and over and done with and done and dusted. I think that was on the parking charges, but that got more than 2,000 signatures. One of the new petitions is on whether Tower Hamlets should retain the directly elected mayoral system. And so far, and it's only got a few more days to run, there's only 315 signatures on that petition.
Oh, wow.
So maybe we all need to work together a little bit more and get through to the voters and organise movements for change a little quicker. Mind you, politics can move very quickly. So I don't think the mayors should be complacent.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I think, Jenny, perhaps I'm putting words in your mouth, but I certainly, I'm not in favour of the directly elected mayor. I hope the petition wins. I'm not sure if I'll sign it. If I haven't signed it already, I'll go and sign it tonight. And you'd have thought it would get a few more signatures, but as you say, I think we all need to be better organised in these things.
Indeed. Okay, so we will definitely end on that note. Thank you, dear listener, dear viewer, for listening and watching. And we'll see you again next Tuesday at 10 o'clock for another bit of 2020 vision on East London. And I think next Tuesday is actually the 3rd of November, which I think actually is the US presidential election. So,
It is.
Yes, we'll probably be no clearer then on what's happening. So, but we'll try to find something else interesting to talk to. If you've got any ideas, pop them in the comments box, and where indeed Keith Oberman has in fact appeared on the comment box. So thank you for that, Nicola, and listeners, viewers, we'll see you again next week. So good evening now.